ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Belinda Probert grew up in a lovely house in the English countryside. It had its own small wood of copper beech trees and variously a Bentley or a Jag parked in the driveway. Her father was an Englishman named Bill, a decorated war hero who became a successful businessman. Or so Belinda thought. 4 months after Bill died at age 78, Belinda's understanding of her father began to unravel when a letter arrived from a relative in Wales. Bill had told his wife and children that he had no living family, but it turned out that wasn't true. Nor, they learned, had he started life called Bill. Nor was he an Englishman, and nor were all his international trips limited to business. Belinda's book about uncovering her father's story is called Bill's Secrets. Hi, Belinda.
Hi, Sarah.
Tell me about the man that you knew growing up. What are some of your earliest memories of your father?
My father was I always thought of him as travelling and being interesting. Like, he was definitely not, just like other suburban or stockbroker belt fathers. He was often overseas in exotic places. He was distant in a way that's perhaps quite common for fathers, distant in the sense of not involved in our daily lives. Our daily lives revolved absolutely around our mother. But he was when he was there, you were very aware he was in the house and present. Everybody remembers him as a kind of powerful presence. So he was slightly glamorous because of the travel, all these passports stuck together, but also slightly intimidating. He was not a cosy man.
What did he look and sound like? I guess particularly when you were a child and he was that powerful presence in the house. How would you describe him?
Well, he definitely sounded absolutely English with as we used to say, the Queen's English, not the King's English. Very well spoken. He had a lovely turn of phrase. He was extremely good with words. Not that he talked a lot or anything like that, but he spoke very well, and you kind of stopped and listened, partly because of the way he spoke, often with humour, but also because he had a beautiful voice. He was also, whenever he was going off to work, immaculately dressed. He would be wearing a beautiful suit as he headed off to the city or to the airport or wherever it was.
Did he ever talk much about his own family, his own childhood?
Not a word. Not a sausage. It's quite extraordinary. When, looking back, of course you take it for granted. I just thought, well, he hasn't got one. And because there was no hinge for us to kind of, on him to open up anything into the past, he had this incredible ability to be in the present and to sort of close off in ways that are quite hard to unpick his past. So he never mentioned anything. I never recall him saying anything about any relative or anything in his past. He only ever lived in the present, really, now I come to think about it.
And what had he told your mother? I mean, did she ever meet anyone in his family?
No, she didn't. So she told me that when they met in Vienna after the war, that he had said his parents had died. I can't remember, I think in some kind of act, he said, anyhow, they were dead, definitely dead. He owned up to having one brother who was also dead. And he only mentioned this brother because when they were expecting their first child, my older brother, he asked, my mother told me this, he asked if it was a boy, if it could be called Colin, after his older brother. So there was, nothing to kind of go back to. But the astonishing thing was that he managed to sort of close off that. So it just never occurred to you to ask.
What about his time in the Second World War? I mean, you knew he'd been in the war. Was that something he spoke much about?
I don't recall him ever talking about it. We knew about it because as children in the 50s, we grew up reading comics about the Second World War. My brothers and I have very clear recollections of these comics, but my father never spoke about it. We knew and took for granted that he had these parachute boots, which we knew are parachute boots.
What does a parachute boot look like?
Well, it was leather lace-up, comes right up to below the knee, and it's, to kind of cushion your foot when you're landing from a parachute. But we knew that's what they were, and we also knew he had medals because they were in a drawer in my parents' bedroom, and we used to get them out and look at them.
Where were the parachute boots kept at your place?
They were kept just in the boot room. We had a little boot room out the back where you took your boots off, your gum boots off, and they just lived there. And we used to put them on for dress-ups occasionally, clonk around in them. And he had he kept his army greatcoat as well, because it was a rather good coat. And so they were just around, but it never occurred to us to say, what are they for exactly?
You went to Wimbledon with your father once when you were young. What do you remember about a man approaching your father there?
Isn't it funny, the things that, stay in your mind, of all things? So, yes, I did go to Wimbledon, and, you always went out to eat strawberries between games. And I remember us being in the strawberry enclosure and a man approaching my father and saying something sort of respectful or slightly reverential. And I don't remember my father and I discussing it, but I know my father was wearing his parachute tie. And the parachute regiment tie is a very powerful symbol in British military history. Not many people have the right to wear it. And, this would have been in the late 50s, so 10 years after the end of the war, maybe even a little bit more than that. It still had that power. Somebody, had seen it and knew what it was and either had some experience, but wanted to acknowledge my father must have done something brave probably because he was wearing that tie. So it was we didn't talk about it, but I absolutely remember it. I can see us clearly. I can remember the strawberries in particular.
You became a teenager in the 1960s, Belinda, which was, of course, an era where famously parents and children came to blows or came to conflict about different ways of seeing the world. Was that the case for you with your dad? How did your relationship change as you became a teenager?
Yes, it did. And the 60s, there was upheavals going on everywhere, and we all found our bit of the upheaval to latch onto, and mine was the oppositional politics. I remember at school we had a school debate organised. We must have been a general election, and I remember I ran as the communist candidate, and I had no idea where did I get that idea? Where did that come from? I think I didn't really start arguing until I'd left school. Even something simple like putting a Vote Labour poster in our house in London, and he was enraged. I was amazed how enraged he was, and I couldn't work out afterwards whether it was that I was signaling to the neighbours something, or whether he was just, I actually really don't know why, but he was really angry.
You ended up moving to Australia as still a young woman after finishing your PhD and worked here as an academic your whole career, really. How did things change between you once you'd left his immediate orbit? What sort of relationship did you have as he got older and you got older?
He wrote fabulous letters because when I moved here, this is 1976, you couldn't afford to lift the phone. I think when he lifted it at Christmas, he wrote wonderful letters. He didn't write that often. My mother wrote all the time, but when he did write, they would be funny, descriptive of what was happening in his life, warm. They were very charming. I think he wrote great letters. And he could be he could send himself up too in ways that he might not have so much if I'd been right. And there was less room for prickliness. So they were lovely letters, really lovely letters that he wrote to me.
He and your mother had moved to France in their late 60s, and that's where they were living when he passed away. Did you go there for the funeral?
I did indeed. My brothers and I, we'd converge. I have one brother in San Francisco, one in northern France. And when he died, we did all come to the funeral. And it was very small. And he was buried in this beautiful cemetery in the village, which is just a village cemetery, and slight slope looking out to the Pyrenees. It was just a very perfect place, really, for him to be.
And how was he spoken about at the funeral? What sort of way was he being remembered?
There wasn't, nothing much was said. When looking back now, of course, I can see that's odd. Like when my mother died and was buried, the funeral was in the same church, and I spoke some length, and other people then joined in and spoke. But his funeral, I don't think anybody. I think the priest simply said something about his connection, reasonably strong connection now to the local community in the village, and that was it.
How did you discover that Bill was not actually Bill or didn't begin life Bill?
Oh, what a story. 4 months after he died, my mother got a letter, and she had a postman. It's a small village and the postman knows everybody and everything, and he handed the letter over the gate, and she described this to me. And it was addressed to Mr. Probert. And so, of course, my mother opened it, and it was from someone in Brecon, who signed himself off as Denzil Griffiths. And it was a warm letter saying, I've been looking for you for decades, and just by chance, I've finally found you, and I'm coming to visit you. Actually would have been there now, or would have come earlier, but I was ill and unable to come. But don't be surprised if I turn up on your doorstep. And then describing something about this man's life, like he'd been the mayor of Brecon and his wife and his family. And my mother's reading this thinking, I wonder who this is. So she wrote back saying, I'm really sorry about this, but I know you've been looking for him for all this time, but he died 4 months ago. And can you tell me who you are? And bang, by return of post comes this letter saying, dear, and it's so Welsh. It's so Welsh. It says, dear Auntie Janet, like, Auntie Janet, Roy was, do you mind if I call him Roy? Because that's how we all knew him. Roy was my uncle. And out comes this story that Bill was born Roy Probert, that he'd grown up in the Rhondda, that he'd had altogether 5 siblings, and that Denzil had always thought of him as a hero and been longing to... Denzil would have been about 10 when he last saw my father during the war. He's much younger, and had been looking for him for all this time. And
how did your mother react? I mean, was she completely shocked? Did she believe it?
Oh, she did. Yeah, I think it was an extraordinary surprise, but at some level, maybe not. I don't know, because her first reaction was worry that her own very privileged background had made her completely insensitive to the fact that he might have not come from somewhere, even though he sounded like it, that she might have been the reason he'd hidden his past. That did worry, that got to her. But everybody, asks this, didn't your mother know? Didn't she ask? And I think there are several things going on. One is absolutely that they met aged about 29. They had lost their 20s to the war. They were just not interested in the past. It's very hard to imagine what it might have been like to suddenly see the future in front of you and to fall in love. So I think that's one element. And the other element is that there is especially an English sort of middle upper class tendency to not talk about things, to not open up about the past. So I think there is that element, but I think he must have, to carry that off over your whole life, to never accidentally let slip that in fact you've got 5 brothers and sisters, to do that, I think you have to have made some very conscious decision. But she immediately arranged to go with my younger brother to Wales to meet all the family and the relatives. So she was, I think that's amazing, really. She just, no, I've got to go and meet them. Sadly, nearly everybody was dead, but they met Denzil. So Denzil was the son of one of Dad's sisters and Denzil's wife and their children. And the frustrating thing was that Denzil could really, he could say, well, this is where he grew up, the address. We could get the names of his parents. We could get the name of his siblings. We could get all that. But not much else, because Denzil had been a child when the kind of rift or whatever it was happened. So he couldn't shed much light on it. So it was a bit frustrating, to say the least.
When did you first go to this part of the world after knowing this?
So I went nearly 10 years after Dad died. I was in England and I had the time. And I went and sort of did what they did. I stood outside the house where I knew he'd lived until he went to university. I went to a coal mine museum to kind of try to get a grip on what it would have been like. I then drove over the Brecon Beacons and went to meet Denzil as well. And I found where his parents had been buried, the graveyard in the Rhondda. And I went and stood and found his brothers, the one we're allowed to know about, Colin, who was buried there. But, I'm thinking, but I've got nothing to go on. I'm standing here, but can I imagine what this was like? Do I feel like these are my relatives? It was very hard to make any sense of it that time.
So, Belinda, what did finally push you to find out what you could about your father's past?
Well, my brothers, I can say this because they're not around to contradict me, but they're very bad at, communicating. They never wrote letters. All our adult lives, we've lived on different continents. So we decided at the end of COVID that we're in our 70s. We have to get together. This is ridiculous. And we decided it has to be in San Francisco because my older brother's wife is very ill. And so we're going to go there. So we thought, okay, we'll just spend 2 weeks together, which is, more time we've spent together since we were kids. And the idea was not to talk about Dad at all. It was really to talk about ourselves and our families. But we went to Monterey to go out whale watching. Turned out that that week was a huge vintage car auction. And we were walking back from our whale trip and we see a Bentley and we think, oh, look, isn't that the Bentley Dad had? And so on the way back, we're thinking, what on earth was he doing with a Bentley like that when we were kids? My younger brother was almost born in it. And that triggered, we went back and sat down and had dinner. And then we started more kind of conversations about, well, why was he doing that? And then the key point, I think, which made me really get interested was my brothers disagreeing about why he did it. No, we're never really going to know, but why did he do this very dramatic break? Why did he hide the past? Why couldn't he just become the new person? And my younger brother still, I think he kind of keeps defaulting to it, thinks it was shame. He was ashamed of his background or, wanted to hide it because he couldn't cope with telling people about it. And my older brother said, no, not in a million years. He wasn't ashamed of anything. He knew that to have the life he wanted to have, he'd have to get rid of that past. He just did it. And there was nothing he was ashamed about. And I think, oh, gosh, these are two very different men, And that's kind of what made me think, well, okay, let's have one more go at digging up everything we thought we knew and checking whether it was true and seeing if we can find out anything else.
Were you nervous at all as you embarked on this, Belinda, about what you might find, if you might find things that would undermine the feelings you had, the respect you had for your father?
I think what reassured me was that I was reasonably confident, very confident, that I would not find a mistress. I knew his relationship with my mother was very remarkable and very strong and how much he depended on her. And I just felt, because that's the one thing that would have been wouldn't have been keen to find that. And I suppose I thought, is there something about this rupture with Wales where he did something?
So what did you find out about where your father was born and what kind of family he grew up in?
So he was born in 1915 in the Rhondda Valley, which is famous around the world for the quality of the coal that it produced. And the only reason for all the villages that were built up the Rhondda Valleys was coal mining. And it started in the mid-19th century, really, but it peaked in the period just before the First World War. And his parents, both his mother and his father, their parents had come to the Rhondda to get work. They'd been working in coal or blacksmithing beforehand, but they were drawn to the Rhondda as this extraordinary booming coal economy. But it was horrendous conditions. People lived in these tiny houses with no bathrooms. The rivers were filled with, people just chucked everything into the river that ran along the valleys. The poverty was extreme, and the ill health because of the overcrowding. People were pouring into these valleys to work in these coal mines. And the coal mines were owned by voracious, not employers you could recommend in any way at all. And so when I'd sort of seen the house that he grew up in, but then I found the house that he was born in, and I went and stood outside that. And the ceilings are so low, they're just the height of the door. And in that house, I now know there was his parents and a baby sister who died and 4 siblings, and they're all in this tiny house. It just, it beggars belief. It's very hard to imagine just how poverty-stricken that area was.
And was it a Welsh-speaking area? Would he have grown up speaking Welsh, hearing Welsh?
Yes, the Rhondda was a Welsh-speaking area. Because there were so many immigrants coming in from England, from other parts of Wales, there were a lot of people coming in who were not Welsh speakers. But Welsh was so dominant that many of them learnt it. And what I was able to find from the census data, thank you, census, is that his father is Welsh-speaking, comes from a Welsh-speaking family. His mother is from an English family who've come for coal. Her father came for coal. And she appears sometimes as speaking both. So he and his school would have had a lot of Welsh speaking going on. He would have spoken Welsh.
His father, as you say, was a blacksmith in the local mine. His brothers were working in the mines, his uncles, etc. And his father died suddenly at home from a stroke when Bill was just 11. And you have to imagine that the death of a father, of a breadwinner like that, would have put enormous pressure on your dad to also leave school and help the family financially. How did he avoid that?
Yes, it does. And it's very, imagining, being able to see on the death certificate what time he died and thinking, Dad would have been there. He would have come home from it. It kind of made it more living, real. I could begin to imagine it. So he is the youngest, and I think that's what gives him the opportunity, that he's got 2 older brothers and 2 sisters who have no work, because very little work for women. They have to move away from the area to go into service. But the 2 brothers have got jobs. And it appears that what his mother does is take in lodgers. And Welsh take education seriously, so that's another lucky stroke. They do. So the school, probably, that he was at, the primary school, would have said to his mother, Minna, this is a boy who can get a scholarship. You should really try and let him do this. And so I started, doing my research job and found that there are archives which have records of these schools and records of the scholarships. So off I went to Cardiff and sat in the room looking at the records of scholarships for 1928, 1929, 27, thinking that's when he would have started at this school. And suddenly there he is getting a governor's scholarship. And then you can see each year after he gets it again. So yes, that's how he did it.
He had told your mother and you that he had gone to university in London, to King's College. Was that true?
It was. That was another tick. And luckily, again, I was easy to find the records of him graduating. So, and I don't think we ever doubted that. He had such a gift with languages and a knowledge of French literature. He had to have gone to university. So,
did he study languages at university?
Yes, French and Spanish. I thought, okay, now that there's got to be money somewhere, because the family, no way they could afford it. So what I finally found was that he had got a local government scholarship. And I looked at all the records of everyone who got one of these, a Rhondda County scholarship to go to university. And nearly everyone who got one went to one of the new Welsh universities, and just a few went to England. And he was one of the few. So he got, it turns out it was actually a scholarship which you had to say you were going to be a teacher to get. It was a way you could get money. And it gave him paid his fees, but also gave him a living allowance. So it paid for him to be a student.
You managed to track down the daughter of Dickie Flynn, a friend that your dad had made at university and whom he entered the military with on the outbreak of the Second World War. What insights could she give you about your father's trajectory from being Welsh Roy to English Bill?
It was wonderful, because they couldn't tell me a lot, but Dymphna, his daughter, whom finally I exchanged lots of letters with, she passed me information about Dickie's war and Bill's war, and they would refer to him as Roy. So they clearly knew him as Roy. They knew he was both Roy and Bill. And he would have seen his transition during the war. But Dymphna was also found these photographs of them together in Cairo when they're very young, 24, 25. They've arrived in Cairo after about a month's training as intelligence officers, and they're standing they're in civvies, going out on the town. And there are these photographs. And because we have no photographs of Dad, we had none, because, of course, now I think, how weird not to have any childhood photographs. We had never seen photographs of him before, wartime photographs. But here were ones that weren't him in uniform. They were of him standing, looking to camera, and suddenly I can see, that's what he was like.
What was he like? How did he come across in those unstaged photographs?
Well, what is such a giveaway is that he has not learned to be Bill yet, Posh Bill. He is dressed like someone from an American gangster movie. So he's wearing a black shirt and a wide white tie and immaculate baggy pants that drop down onto his two-tone shoes. He's just looking like he stepped out of an American movie. And his friend Dickie is wearing much more normal, he's kind of looking ordinary jacket and tie. And he's not worked out. He's definitely left the Rhondda, but he's not yet worked out who he is. It's such a giveaway. No posh Englishman would be seen dead in a black shirt with a wide white tie like that.
So he was trying out these different identities maybe at this point, but he joined the military intelligence. Why would they have selected him?
Both he and Dickie, absolutely. I now think they made the move. There was a desperate need for linguists. When the Second World War started, intelligence was absolutely a low ebb. Nobody put any money into it. And they were about to send troops to France. This is before Hitler invaded France. So they were about to send British troops to France, and nobody spoke French. And so they were desperate for people who could accompany military units who were both soldiers but also had language. So he and Dickie would have been picked up because they both spoke French and Spanish, and I think Dickie spoke Italian. So within a twinkling, they'd been accepted and passed and sent off to Cairo, where most of the intelligence relating to French North Africa and the French campaign, and Italy, of course, because Italy had colonies in North Africa, that's where they were needed.
As the war progressed, Bill was sent further into Africa. What kind of experiences did he have there? What sort of encounters did he have during the war in Africa?
This is the bit that's very frustrating, but because he ended up with special operations within the broad intelligence umbrella, his file is secret. It's very frustrating. Like, I know he was in Tobruk, and that's where he first met Australians, the rats of Tobruk. But what he was actually doing, apart from, intelligence work, it's called political warfare that he was involved in. And then he was moved to other parts, especially on the east coast, because of the danger of German movements up and down the east coast of Africa. But what he exactly was doing, hard to tell.
He ended up on a one-man mission to look for Japanese submarines.
Yes, astonishing. I think he got bored. He was in Madagascar and volunteered to go on this huge trek to the Comoro Islands in this little boat with a couple of, obviously, people who knew how to sail the boat. They're always looking for Japanese submarines, but there weren't any. But yes, I mean, he just, to volunteer for something like that is kind of, he had a sense of adventure and incredible, you could call it foolhardiness, really.
Podcast, broadcast, Conversations with Sarah Konoski.
Belinda, after being recruited by British intelligence, your father rose up the ranks of the military, becoming a captain. Was he lying about his background by this point while he was in the army? Is there any record of him misrepresenting who he was or where he'd come from?
I think he was very good at not lying. He just kind of didn't say things. So the one thing that he put in his record, which threw me off the scent for a bit, was that he spent a year at the Sorbonne. Now, he didn't. He actually was doing a trainee teaching, which you had to do if you were being paid by the Rwanda government to do. You had to go and do, if you're going to be a secondary school language teacher, you had to spend time in France. So that year, he called that a year with the Sorbonne, when actually he'd been an assistant teacher in a lycée somewhere in Provence. But he didn't tell many lies. He told very few lies, but one was on their marriage certificate where he said his father was a mine manager. Now, he wasn't. He was a blacksmith. But I think what he managed to explain was that his parent been manager and he'd left Wales early. There was a kind of nothing to see here, nothing interesting. In his war record, he doesn't have to disclose, I don't think he had to disclose his father's occupation. But when you got married then, on the marriage certificate, you had to disclose your father's occupation. Seems extraordinary now.
Your father was decorated for his involvement in an operation in the Pyrenees in France. What was that and how did that come to be?
So this is one bit we kind of knew about because we knew he'd been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for this operation. And also it's written up in many books, not that I kind of really paid much attention to it. But what is interesting, I think, in terms of understanding him is that he was with Special Operations Executive in Cairo, where a huge amount of work was being done because of the liberation of France from the south and Italy, organised from North Africa. So he's there and he is in Cairo undergoing more training for political warfare, which is, you're going to be sent somewhere which is about to be liberated, and we need people in there who have got a very clear idea about who are the goodies and who are the baddies and what's going on. So he's doing that training, and I think actually he was going to be sent to Yugoslavia, but he volunteers for one of these missions which are going to be launched into France once the invasion starts in Normandy. So the main army of invasion is, of course, from the north, but the minute it starts, British intelligence is sending these tiny groups to various places in France where there are strong groups of resistance fighters to arm them and to organise them so that there'll be this, fighting going on within France as well as the main invasion.
It sounds incredibly risky.
Well, absolutely. And they are told that because Hitler had actually passed an explicit law which anybody caught in these was to be summarily executed. There was to be no taking of prisoners. That's what would happen, And so you did not put your hand up for it if you were looking for a cosy way out of the war. I mean, the end of the war was clearly, I'm saying clearly coming. I think, they would have seen that it is going to end. And instead of lying low somewhere, he puts his hand up for one of these operations, and he goes to be trained in a special camp in Algiers. So they're all being trained, ready for the moment when intelligence will decide now is the moment to drop into various parts of France. He was chosen to drop into the Ariège, which is down in the southwest of France, and to connect up with active resistance groups, who in this case were mostly Spanish fighters.
So this is where those parachute boots were
yes.
put to use.
Yes, indeed. And of course, he never spoke about it, but he was, all these interventions were always usually three people. There'd be a Frenchman always, there'd be an allied, either an American or a British usually, and someone who spoke the local language or came from the local area. And Bill was partnered with a Frenchman called Marcel Bijard, who went on to be a very famous general and wrote lots of books, handily, very handy. So he's written all these accounts of the detail of their training, of the flight over the Mediterranean, of how they drop out of the hole in the circular hole in the bottom of the plane. They can see the fires lit, and it's astonishing to have this kind of very visceral description of the landing.
And he wasn't executed. He went on to be your father. So it was a success. What happened?
It was a remarkable success. So he and Bijard linked up with a very active and very well-organised group of Spanish resistance fighters who were essentially hoping to, after the liberation of France, that everyone would go and liberate Spain from Franco. That was their aim. But they were very well organised. And there were large numbers of German deployments in the area. Foix, the town that they liberated first, was a headquarters, and there was a Gestapo place there. It was an important part of the German presence in the region. And luckily there are actually quite good accounts, and indeed I have, which I'd never read before. Well, my mother had it, and then she gave it to me, and luckily I didn't throw it away. The actual account that he wrote, reporting back to SOE about what happened. And it's very detailed about how they realised how many Germans there were and how they tricked them and how they set up roadblocks and realised that the only way to defeat them was a kind of guerrilla warfare. There were far too many Germans, and how they'd organise airdrops of weapons, give them to the Spanish, tell the Spanish to get in their cars, get into the hills, and just do random attacks everywhere. So they were kind of organising this guerrilla war. And they were kind of having to make it up as they went along, because until they were there, they didn't know the competencies or the numbers exactly of the people they had to fight with, because there were just three of them.
Incredible. And it was for this that after the war your father was awarded a Distinguished Service Award, which is a very high award in the British military. So he survived the war as a decorated war hero. Did he visit his family back in Wales ever during the war, or once the war was over? You'd imagine this would be the great moment of homecoming, that you've survived and you return to your Welsh village and reunite with your surviving mother and siblings?
Yeah, absolutely, you would think so. Like 5 years he's been overseas, and my mother believes that he never got home during those 5 years, which wouldn't have been uncommon, that he never was able to go back because he was in Africa, North Africa. But in my sleuthing, I do think that he did manage to get back once. And this is something that Denzel told us. He said, yes, he did. He came back and he brought his mother a crocodile handbag, crocodile skin handbag. I'm thinking, that's too good a true. You wouldn't make that up, I'm sure he did. That's 1942, he manages to do that. But then after that, no, I'm sure he never got back. So there we are, end of 1944. He's the hero. Paris has been liberated. He's coming back to London, and he does not, as far as we know, go and see any member of his family. So I think it had happened. Whatever had happened.
What do you mean? What had happened?
Well, the rupture is so radical that there's no record, there's nothing that suggests he ever went back to Wales or made any contact. So Denzel said that they found out about the family, he and his dad's living sisters and his mother, found out about his wedding because it was on the front page of in the Times announcement column. They found out about his medal, and because that was written up in Welsh papers. Actually, it was big enough story, going to the palace and being given it by the king. That made the news. But Denzel says that's how they knew about the medal and about his getting married, but from the papers. So, yeah, that suggests he did not make any contact.
And as far as you could find out or know, Belinda, it wasn't that there had been some terrible rift or argument or falling out over a specific thing between him and his family. It was just that, he grabbed this opportunity to reinvent himself from that rupture caused by the war.
I think that is the case. But my older brother has always had this view. It's funny how, he's always had the view that Dad's mother, Minna, was a bit of a tyrant. She was a Sabbatarian. She was so religious that they didn't do the washing up on Sundays, waited till Monday. That someone told me.
I didn't know I could use religion to justify that.
It's a good one, isn't it? It's a good one. It's a very good one. And she wouldn't even knit, so you're talking extreme, which is not uncommon in some Welsh churches at the time. So not doing things on the Sabbath is a very Welsh and especially South Wales thing. So she's not that weird. But it suggests a kind of, Colin likes to think, my brother thinks that, she was really unbending. He has rude words. He has no basis for saying this really, but he liked to think that Dad found her just simply unbearable. She was, maybe tyrannical. And certainly there's no evidence of any kind of warmth that went on in the family. I don't get the sense that nobody says anything warm about her, and Denzel never says anything warm about her. So I think that's, she might have been like that. But that seems a bit extreme to cut off all your family because your mother's like that. To cut off your sisters and his favourite brother's dead now. He dies during the war. So that's definitely, that cuts perhaps something that made him go back. But in the end, I do think somehow that he just decided, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be this new person.
Does it feel cruel to you? Like, I think about a child that you've known have survived this incredibly dangerous war and have survived, for them not to ever come and see you again, to pretend you're not there. Even if you weren't a very warm mother, that seems a brutal act for a child to commit against their family.
Yes, it does. And that's why I think I've spent some time thinking, maybe she was really horrible, like trying to find some way to make it less brutal, because it is brutal. And it makes me think that somehow she'd made it possible for him to do this. You know what I mean? Somehow that by her personality had made it possible for him to do it, because he was a warm and moral kind of person. Like it's not a cold man at all. So I think the war would have been a perfect opportunity. There he is, miles away from anywhere, with people who don't know him from a bar of soap, apart from Dickie Flynn. And he's able to watch and to see, you meet an extraordinary range of people in the army and during the war, and to read, how people speak, how they behave, especially in the British Army, which is riddled with class behaviours and class privileges. He would have seen how it worked. It was a kind of perfect laboratory for him to hear different voices. And he had an extraordinary gift for languages. He could speak almost any language. He chose to learn a few words. People would think he was a native speaker. He'd just say a few three words and they think, oh my goodness. He had an incredible ear. And so it would not have been difficult for him. His gift for languages played into this. But I think during the war, it's perfect. He's miles away from anyone he knows, and he can just become this. And he moves up the ranks. And he's always moving regiments because they're always attached to different regiments. So he's always meeting new people. I think it's kind of the perfect environment for him to become fully formed Bill by the time the war ends.
And it's as Bill that he meets and falls in love with your mother, Janet, and after what sounds a very romantic kind of courtship in Naples and then in Vienna, they're married in 1945, and eventually he launches himself into the world of business when they move back to England. Was he continuing his intelligence work after the end of the Second World War? Is that something that you've been able to find out?
It was one of the things that quite surprised me, really, because my mother certainly never thought so. In fact, she thought when they met in Vienna that he was just running the interpreters' pool. And, it's quite obvious to me now he wasn't. Vienna, Vienna in 1945 is seething with spies. The Russians are there, the French are there, the British are there, the Americans are there. They're all trying to, it's just like it's the third man. It's like, so she was very naive in some ways, I think. But when he was demobbed and went into, civilian life, I think none of us thought that he had anything really more to do with the military, and certainly my mother didn't. And it was only when thinking about a particular incident when he went to France in the early 50s to meet his colleague from the landings in France, Marcel Bijard, who was coming back from Vietnam, where he'd been fighting for many years and been a prisoner. And he was coming back on a military plane. And Bijard writes how he arrives back after the fall of North Vietnam from Dien Bien Phu, and he's been a prisoner. I mean, it's a pretty hairy story, and most of his regiment have been killed. And he arrives back in Paris at Orly Airport, and he steps down the runway, and there is Bill, he says in his book, and my wife. Bill, oh, how, how wonderful, what a gesture of friendship. He's deeply moved, tears come to his eyes. And when I'm reading this after, it's actually my brother said, how did Bill know to be there? Like he says, I haven't spoken to Bill Bijard writes, I have not seen him for 10 years or spoken to him. And yet there he is at the bottom of the stairs.
At the meeting the military plane as it returns to France.
That
does sound like a little alarm bell might be ringing there.
Yeah, exactly. And then so my brother says, oh, of course, MI6 sent him. They'd be wanting very, very keen to get the inside briefing on what happened, as the collapse of the French Empire goes on, because they've got an empire collapsing. And then my mother's there too, and I'm thinking, oh, gosh. And they go and stay, my parents go and stay with Bijard and his wife in their country place for a few days. And Bijard writes, oh, Bill, he loves Dad. He's very moving, oh, Bill. And then he says something to the effect of, I don't know what his job is, though. Maybe he's in intelligence. As he actually says that, because Dad is clearly pumping him. I think, oh, okay, right.
Once you see that, it sheds a different light on the fact that your father had professional roles that allowed him to travel a lot through South America, to China very early on when that was uncommon. And so under, I guess, that cloak of professional contacts, there would have been, it would seem, a very good opportunity or possibility that he was also involved in work on behalf of British intelligence.
Yes, I think luckily, and this is luck of the draw when you do family history, I found that, actually someone else told me about it, I didn't manage to find it, but there was a company magazine, the company he worked for, which was the perfect import-export James Bond cover. I mean, they had offices everywhere. But they have a company magazine from the mid-50s onwards, very glossy, designed to keep this whole global enterprise informed about what's going on. And in it describes who's travelling where and what they're doing. And there's pictures of my father each year, where he's been. And then I'm thinking, I'm sure 1956, I think he was in Cairo. He was in Egypt. What was he doing in Cairo? They had business there, no doubt about it. And I'm thinking 56, Suez. Well, and then, yes, China. And there are all sorts of patterns where I just think he's on the books with MI6 and they use him when they want to find, something found out. And then the son of the director of the company he worked for confirmed to me, so amazing when you find these people and they can tell you these things. He said, oh, yes, I remember that people from the Foreign Office used to come round to our house, to talk about things quite often. So the links with Foreign Office MI6 were kind of seamless at the very top of the company. It wasn't like Dad had to hide. The company management would have known.
So it's not just that you found out that your father was the son of a Welsh miner, but that he was a spy.
Yes.
This is more interesting than much family history, can I say, Belinda?
I know. It's bloody great, isn't it? Like I'm thinking, it is good. It is good. It's,
really repaid all those hours of trawling on military websites and all those reading of company histories to come up with the goods on this.
Yeah, because that was a total surprise. That was,
a total surprise, and it's something that your mother wasn't aware of, as far as you know.
No, because she definitely wasn't.
And this is what you've discovered after your mother has also passed away. So this is something that you and your brothers can share with one another. So your father had so diligently separated himself from the place that he spent the first 18 years of his life. He was this Englishman above all Englishmen. So where did he move with your mother after he retired at 59? Back
to Wales. So peculiar. I find this very baffling. So he took up fishing. He's incredibly good at, okay, that's over. I'm going to find something new to do. And I'm not quite sure what triggered it, but he went on a fly fishing course in Wales. He could have gone fishing much closer to where they were living in London, but he went to Wales and he loved it. He loved the fishing. And so he up sticks, sold the house in London and went and built a house in Wales. And looking at it now, I realise, because now I know this, I mean, we didn't then, of course it just seemed perfectly normal then, but I now realise, now I've been to, mapped where all his relatives were. As he's going there, he's driving within, a few kilometres of where he grew up and where, in fact, one of his brothers is still living. He and my mother are going walking on the Brecon Beacons, just close to where poor Denzel, who's been looking for him for 2 decades, is living. And he loves Wales, and he persuades my younger brother to come there and to buy a farm together. And he has grandchildren who start going to Welsh-speaking nursery schools. Does he let on that he could help them with their Welsh? Nope.
No, nothing. His accent doesn't change. Nothing shifts?
No, absolutely nothing.
Belinda, that's got to mean something, doesn't it? I mean, that is remarkable. That he took it as a risk, or that he felt it as a compulsion or a homing instinct or something, that he went back to Wales.
Somebody who's read the book, whom I don't know at all, but whose grandparents come from the Rhondda area and migrated to New Zealand to escape, same sort of story, that they're convinced, they've written to me, absolutely convinced that he went back because he yearned for Wales, and and I'm thinking, I don't. There's nothing to, yearning is not really in his vocabulary. I don't think it's yearning. But what it is weird. I mean, he knew it. He knew it was beautiful. It's cheaper to go fly fishing in Wales than in posh parts of England. I don't know, but...
Maybe he even believed his own story by this point. Maybe he wasn't Welsh anymore. He genuinely was this upper-class Englishman that he'd carried off so convincingly for so long.
I think you're on the money. I think that is the only way to make sense of it. I think, he had this incredible capacity to remake himself, but in an integrated way. It was nothing. It wasn't fake. He was genuinely that person. So I think it was. I think you're right. It was possible because he was Bill and not Roy.
And it was Bill who died in France 20 years or so later. So let's go back to that moment where 4 months after your father's death, the village postman hands your mother a letter from this nephew, Denzel, revealing the secret of Bill's origins. I wonder if that letter had arrived when your father was still alive, how would have he reacted?
One of the things that I've tried to check to find out was whether, in fact, he did get any of the earlier letters, because in the book I describe how Denzel, he's always a few years behind. He's always got the address just after Dad's left. And I'm wondering whether he did, in fact, get one of these letters. And I asked my mother before she died, I said, do you think one of Denzel's missives did reach Dad at any point? And she says she thinks it might have, and he just destroyed it. For whatever reason, he must have felt confident that Denzel wasn't going to actually appear on his doorstep. But that actually is quite a disturbing question. I find that, difficult to think how would he have reacted. And because he's such a self-made man, and it's not like he's fake, you know what I mean? It's easy to think that he's made himself. He is what he appears to be at one level, but he is also this other person. And if the two bits had come together, it's it's impossible. I find it very hard to know. And I did actually try to go and see a psychoanalyst and a few other people to say, what do you think would happen? If someone's like this. And unfortunately, the psychoanalyst within a twinkling wanted to psychoanalyze me. Don't you think you're suffering from, I thought, no. And then I found someone else who, also an expert, who absolutely felt that Bill had made himself, he just had this genius and it was quite real. And his success was to pick a wife who genuinely didn't care what his past, and it wasn't relevant because he came over as authentic. He was what he was. And she didn't feel a need, as most English people would do, to know where you went to school. She didn't care. That his genius was that, but had his Welsh past been sprung, don't know.
as you say, this incredibly, impressively self-made man, did you feel that you were betraying that in discovering all of this and making it public? I mean, there's one thing, how would he reacted to a Welsh relative rocking up on the doorstep, but what about his own daughter unpicking that incredibly carefully constructed facade?
Yeah, so I had a little sentimental moment where I thought, oh, he'd be so proud of me, and I thought, no. That, you know, he would at one level, I think he would have loved the story and the way it's told as a kind of admiring story of it, but he would have hated any sense of kind of being patronised or sympathy or, you know, like kind of he would have hated that. So it's very difficult to think about these hypotheticals, really hard.
Has it changed the way you feel about him knowing this? You know, he's been dead a long time now, but we still have relationships with people even after they're gone. Has it changed the way you feel about him, think about him?
I do actually feel there is an element, I feel kind of regret that I might have known another, you know, he might have been a bit different if that had been part of our understanding of him. But then, of course, he wouldn't have been hit, you know, the one I knew. So, again, it's a bit hard. But what struck me was, because I started out thinking of it as a kind of research project, you know, he's at arm's length. He was a very difficult father in many ways, and he and I fought, and we were much happier when we were living on other sides of the world. But now I know how he did it and where he came from. I like him more because I also can see that he enjoyed doing this. It wasn't a kind of, you know, there was nothing bitter and twisted about him as he came out of it. I now know he had a good war in the sense that he was lucky. The war he was given suited him, and he loved his work life. Now, when I was a teenager, I thought all capitalists and all, you know, business was terrible. You know, I was so opposed to, I was not interested. But now I can see just how big the businesses were that he was running, and I think he enjoyed it. And I really like, you know, I think my memories are much more I think personally of him being difficult to me, you know, or being unpredictable and a bit scary sometimes. But I like the thought that he was having a good life. I've enjoyed that very much. So I kind of like him more. I don't feel closer to him, and I don't feel I really know him better. But I'm pleased to have found out all those things.
Belinda, it is a remarkable story, and there's so much more in your book that we haven't had the chance to cover in our conversations. So thank you so much for sharing what you could on Conversations.
Thank you very much for having me.
Belinda Probert's book is called Bill's Secrets. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.